Welcome everybody to our session this afternoon on being intentional about equity. My name is Emily Doolittle, and today for our interactive discussion, we have three participants who I've invited to talk with all of us about being intentional about equity at different stages of the research itself. Just to give you a general plan, we're each going to be sharing very brief slides, and just to kind of orient you to some of the things that we're discussing, some of the topics that we'll be pursuing. But we definitely do want this to be interactive. So I have 2 to 3 questions for each of the participants, but I definitely want audience participation. I would like for you to think of questions. Please feel free to pop those into the chat if you don't want to ask them yourselves. But I will be giving each speaker an opportunity to respond to your questions. So I definitely want you to be thinking about questions you may have for them. So with that, I am going to start us off with just an orientation here to the session today. And so I'm going to share with all of you, sorry. There we go. All right. Give me a thumbs up that you can see my slide. Awesome. All right. So welcome. Being intentional about equity, from project design to data collection and analysis. I'm really excited to be here moderating this session today because I've been thinking a lot about this issue from the perspective of the funder of research and how IES is intentional about equity. So what is our framework here? So I'm taking this from the We All Count project, and this is their data equity framework. And the idea here is that you can be intentional about equity all the way from the stage of being the funder. So how are we making decisions about the kinds of research that we fund, all the way down through dissemination. So what does that mean for IES? So when we think about it, it's kind of cool. We're all about equity, right? It is directly written into the law that created us. So I have here just a picture of the Education Sciences Reform Act that was passed in 2002. And we are celebrating the 20th anniversary, as you all know, this year, 2022. And so it's a great time to reflect on how are we doing? Are we achieving the mission? And here's the mission. When you look at the mission of IES here in the top right of the slide, first, ensure all children have access to a high quality education and close the achievement gap. All right. So right there, in terms of our funding decisions, we're thinking about equity with that framework. So with that idea in mind, I invited Karen and Jim and Wolfgang to talk with us about, and here I would like to stop sharing my slides so I can see all of you, to really tell us their story about their IES funded work and how they've been intentional at the different stages of research. And so with that, I'm going to turn this over to Karen. And I have invited Karen and our other 2 presenters to just give a brief overview of their work. And then I have a couple of specific questions, and then I want you all to think about questions you might have for Karen as we move into this. And so if you're ready, Karen, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thanks so much. I am Karen Thompson. I am an associate professor at Oregon State University, and it's great to be here with you all today. I'm just going to share a couple slides really quickly to talk about the projects I'm involved in that have been funded by IES, and then talk more about equity within the research design process. So currently, I co-PI for one of 2 national research and development centers funded by IES that are focused on secondary English learners. And that R&D center is housed at West Ed. Aida Walke is the PI. And our center has 2 main aims. first, identify and describe systematic barriers that prevent secondary English learners from successfully accessing the general curriculum. And then second, develop and test curriculum materials for secondary English learners. I'm focused on the first of those goals. I'm working with colleagues Ilana Umansky at the University of Oregon and Lee Tsai at UCLA Crest, analyzing administrative data from 4 state partners. So that's a big part of where equity and research design comes in, thinking about the stakeholders that we've been working with as we design our questions about course access for secondary English learners. And I'll go into more detail about that in a second and share the link for our center website. And this current research grows out of a more intensive partnership that was funded by IES back in 2014 between the Oregon Department of Education and Oregon State University, focused again on English language learners, where we asked a lot of really basic questions that hadn't been answered. And one big key was we, in Oregon State data system, there was not an indicator to identify students who had in the past been classified as English learners, but had exited EL services. And so when we tried to estimate or calculate outcomes for the English learner population, we could only do that for current English learners. So we were missing a lot of information about the full population of students. So I've learned a lot through these projects about equity in research design. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and just talk a little bit more about the partnerships. I think in the data equity framework, those of you who have looked at that before will have noticed that even before research design, there's the piece of funding, as Emily was mentioning, and then motivation. Why are you doing this study? And for me, it's really important to, I bring to this my experience as a former bilingual elementary school teacher. And so my motivation is very much that of a practitioner. I still think of myself as a teacher, and I still have lots of teacher friends, and always try to ground what I'm doing in the voices of educators, families, communities, and policymakers. And so those questions of motivation help. I don't ever want to be doing research that's just me as a researcher thinking what might be an interesting question. I want to always be in collaboration with people who are in the practice and policy world, thinking about what is the key question for you. So in my ODE OSU partnership, I actually co-authored an article with 2 of our ODE colleagues about the types of research questions that partnerships can explore. I'll put the link to that article in chat. We talked about considering interest and action. We talked about thinking about the spheres of influence, the spheres of interest and the spheres of action that we each have as researchers, and our spheres of interest and action as participants, and that the most useful questions for us to pursue were those that were within our spheres of interest as researchers and practitioners, and also within our spheres of action, where the answer to this question could lead to some real actions that as researchers and practitioners we could take. So I think that I'm actually going to stop there for now, and I'm happy to answer questions now and later.
Okay, sorry, I had to remember where unmuting was. So Karen, so I want to build on that very last point that you made, which is this, and it was very much reflected in the researcher practitioner partnership program that we used to have, and that grant that you were part of in 2014. And I think one of the intentions of that particular program was to really nurture the partnership piece. But it sounds like that was sort of there, maybe I'm reading between the lines too much. But what the partnership grant allowed you to do was to really think about, like, something about your use of that term, spheres of influence and interest. And I do think that's it's kind of easy to say, but it's really, really, really hard to do. And I know that there's a huge concern with sort of researchers sitting back in their ivory tower and saying, well, it should be this way, you know, but really, so tell us a little bit more about how you do that balance or integration piece at the design stage of the study. And if you could really be very specific when you're talking about English learners as a subgroup. And I don't really like that term subgroup, but so I'm going to just say group, but you know what I mean, right? Like it's sort of this one unique group within a larger group. So I'm, you know, it's sort of how you think of balancing then their needs with that larger group, because that's one of the puzzles for us as a research center is we have to care about everybody, you know, but we do have to care about those achievement gaps. And I just think oftentimes is the balance piece is the part I struggle with personally. But I think I'd like you to tell us more about that and what that looks like for English learners.
Sure. So one thing that's fresh in my mind is just yesterday we had a cross-state partner meeting for our current research center where we had individuals from our 4 state partners talking about key problems of practice in their state related to secondary English learners course access. And we've learned a few things over the years. One is to be really intentional about, even just within the policymaker stakeholder group, who needs to be at the table for those conversations. We invited very intentionally a state leader, someone who oversees, to your point, not just EL instruction or EL assessment, because those people in state agencies or in districts are often sidelined or siloed or not part of the key decision-making about big things like graduation requirements or investments of ESSER 3 funds. So we wanted a state leader there, someone from the research side who really thinks about the data quality, what the data allows us to ask and answer, and then someone with specific responsibilities for EL policy and curriculum and instruction. And I think also we've learned to broaden our view to think about all the stakeholders outside the state agency, not only district administrators or teachers, but also community-based organizations and voices for parents and students. So the link I put to some policy briefs that we developed in our first partnership, we, both in the design phase and throughout the research and in dissemination, we learned to really include state legislators and along with parent advocates, along with people from a variety of immigrant rights organizations, just to really think of all along the way, how could they help shape our questions and our interpretations and our implications. And I think that they all feed into each other. Like our design questions for our research center, our research questions for our current center were informed by all of those stakeholder conversations over the years. So it's not like there's just a finite design phase. I mean, yes, we had to put together a grant proposal with concrete research questions, but they were informed by dissemination of our past partnership projects. I was also just going to add that the National Network for Education Research Practice Partnerships, NERP, I would really recommend as a great organization that's been doing a lot of thinking about partnerships and equity. And they, in thinking about stakeholders and voices that may not always be included, they have a new project to actually fund partnerships that are looking to include student voice in their research process. So you know, going again beyond those who traditionally have been included. And they also have a lot of resources about power dynamics in partnerships that might be useful too. So I'll put those links in chat as well.
I'm really glad you mentioned that issue of power dynamics. I'm not going to go there because in the interest of time, but everybody should like put a little check mark on thinking about power dynamics in these partnerships, because I think that's really key in a lot of different ways. But I do want to get on to, I actually have 2 more questions for you, Karen, so I want to make sure I get to them both. And I think this one is actually really hard because it's asking you to be sort of conscious of something that may not be conscious, so like how do you really dig in and say, okay, so what are like potential biases here? Like, how do you decide, like, what should I be concerned about? And my idea naively is like, oh, I'm at the design stage, so if I kind of work it out now, I won't run into problems down the road. This is sort of like prevention, right? But how do you, so tell us about what you did around that, or how that maybe factored into choices you made at the design phase. And understanding that's what you just said, it's an R&D center, so it represents not a discrete moment in time, but like a culmination of lots of design choices over lots of different years of research.
Yeah, that makes me think of a few different things. One is I'm thinking of in my even just the terminology of the group of students that I focus on is contested, and there are biases inherent in that. So there's been a move to talk about multilingual students and use a more asset-based terminology. But at the same time, if we're looking at the role of the classification process itself and that label, and what are the impacts of state policies around how this group referred to under federal law as English learners are identified and exited from services, then we have conversations all the time internally to our research center, as well as with external partners, about how do we even refer to the group of students that we're focusing on, and what biases are we bringing up through that terminology, using a kind of monolingual framing of calling out English as, is that what we're valuing or not? And at the same time, we often hear push from advocates within the immigrant rights community or our community-based organizations that they want to highlight disparities where they exist, because that's a tool to advocate for funding. So or other kinds of policy attention. At the same time as state legislatures who want to highlight and look to where are the successes, because that helps them look like they were doing a good job of being stewards of the public education system. So I think, again, just being in conversations with lots of partners, I think about the framing from the disability rights community about nothing about us without us, thinking about who is the us and how can we include everyone involved in these analyses.
I think, those are, I mean, it is fascinating with this particular subgroup, this issue of even the label, right, or the terminology is so value laden, right, itself, and that it's going to intersect with bias, right, or lead to potential bias. All right, my last final question to you, and then I'm going to turn it over to the audience if they have a question or two. And this has been on my mind a lot. The last session I was in was about sort of what do we do about COVID and all of our beautiful RCTs, and does it all matter, and does anything make sense anymore? And the punchline is yes, it's all still fine. But I guess, so we really put a lot of value on certain methodologies and from a rigor standpoint. But I think I'm curious what your thoughts are about sort of potential for certain methodologies reinforcing certain biases, and how you thought about that in terms of your particular work with English learners.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So in the article that I co-authored with my colleagues from the Oregon Department of Education and a doctoral student, we talked about 4 types of questions that partnerships were exploring. Data quality questions, we called them, information gathering questions, kind of general descriptive questions, evaluation questions that we're trying to investigate the effect of the causal effect of a policy, and design questions. And I completely agree that there's a lot of emphasis in most funding streams on these, especially evaluation questions of what are the effects. But we found in our own partnership that really the data quality questions, which let us ask better information gathering questions, were the most impactful. That just this idea of being able to identify former English learners in the state data set dramatically changed information about what was an effective practice. You can't figure out what's an effective practice for English learners if you don't know who the students are once they're no longer English learners. So just that basic idea has really reinforced for me the importance of funding these ground level data quality questions. I'm thinking of another partnership that was able to connect data about foster care to education records. That is a huge lift, but then lets you ask so many basic questions that you just didn't know about before. So in that article, we also talk about this sophisticated regression discontinuity we did looking at the impact of a policy that was not actionable in the end because federal policy changed and there was not much that the state could do with what it was interesting from a research perspective to know the answer, but it was not actionable. So for state policymakers. So yeah, I think we need to be constantly examining our from a funding side priorities and research and what gets valued in publications too.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. So I would like now to take a moment, if anybody in the audience would like to ask a question of Karen. I'll do a little wait time. I think I don't know, maybe I didn't see some people unmute themselves, but feel free to unmute yourself and just ask your question. I have no idea if I would see a raised hand. I didn't notice that happening in my last session, but I will pause.
Yes, I just wanted to say that people are able to raise their hand. So it should be at the bottom of your screen. If you want to raise your hand, you can go ahead and press it and it will spotlight you so that way you can talk, or you can just put it in the chat.
Oh, like I just raised my own hand. Can everybody see that? Yes, okay, it works. So that's, and feel free to use the reactions too. I have too much fun with that in the virtual interactive world. Okay, so if there are no questions, we're going to keep moving on, but do feel free to put questions into the chat too, because we can always come back to things. All right, so next I'm going to turn things over to Jim DePerna, and Jim is going to talk to us about one of his IES grants where I think this issue of being intentional about equity when you're thinking about data collection itself and who the source of the data is very critical. I mean, Karen, you obviously were just talking about data quality, right? So data is everywhere, but I'm literally thinking about in the midst of your study and making choices about what instruments to use and who are the respondents are and sort of what that and what equity looks like there. So Jim, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Excuse me, I'm going to apologize. I feel like I've let the pail down. I couldn't get the background to work. For some reason, it kept washing out. So I apologize. It reminds me of the electric company. Remember that scene? 3 of these kids are doing the same thing and one's doing something different. So that's me, I guess, here. The other thing I'm going to apologize a little bit in advance, as Emily knows, I'm actually a few weeks removed from COVID, but occasionally I cough. And so if I have to mute myself quickly, please understand that's the reason. So let me turn here. And hopefully you can see my screen now. Are you seeing the screen? Okay, great. So I just thought I'd do a quick overview of the project, hopefully in 5 minutes or less. So maybe Emily, if I do go long, you could give me a cue there. But this is the ACES2 project, which actually is a measurement development project. So which are a little less common, I guess, in the IS funding scope than some of the other goals or topics. And this project was funded about 18 months ago, back in 2020. And you probably hear me refer to as a Goal 5 project, because when we started the application process, that's what it was called. And so it's always etched in my mind that way. But so my colleagues, of course, this is a team effort, as all IES funded projects are. And so my colleagues, of course, myself, involved, and I didn't say before, but I'm a faculty member here at Penn State. And then Chris Anthony, who's at the University of Florida in the school psychology program. My other colleague here at Penn State is Dr. Puiwa Lei, and she's a fantastic methodologist. We've worked together for a long time. And then Steve Elliott, who's a consultant to the project, but has been involved with the development of the original version of these scales, who's out at Arizona State as well. And I was reflecting on this as I was pulling together this slide, that across these three individuals, I have 10, 20, and almost 30 years of collaborative experience, which is hard for me to believe when I say that out loud. But I think maybe to some of Karen's points, thinking about how we often view that, I think, in the grant proposal review process, for example, is a strength when we have teams that work together for a long time, but I think it creates some potential blind spots when we think about some of the issues that we're here talking about today, and we'll come back to that in a second. So the primary goal for this project is to revise and update the academic competence evaluation scales, which are standardized questionnaires or behavior rating scales, if you will, that Steve and I developed a number of years ago to assess the skills, attitudes, and behaviors of kids and learners in K-12 settings primarily, although there's a college form as well. It's not really a focus of this particular project. But so there's a teacher version of that measure, and then a student version. So for teachers to provide their perspective on their students in their classroom, and then for students themselves to reflect on themselves as learners, and to assess where they see their strengths and weaknesses. And those strengths and weaknesses really focus on two broad domains as you think about successful learners or being successful in the classroom. Academic skills and what we've called academic enablers. There's lots of different terms, especially now, I think, for those types of skills. So non-cognitive skills, social emotional part of that. The academic skills, of course, we focus on reading, math, critical thinking types of skills. And then on the enabler side, in its current iteration, the original form, we focus on 4 domains. So interpersonal or social skills, study skills, motivation in the classroom and motivation to learn, and then engagement, and particularly active engagement in classroom settings. So that's the constructs that are included in the original forms. And these are items that use Likert type responses. Now, our goal for the ACES 2 project, or our goals, we have 4 of those goals. One is to expand construct coverage. So as you can see there, the original ACES was published in the year 2000. So it's been over 2 decades since its publication, and even more than that since we started the development of it. And of course, there's been a lot of work, particularly on the enablers side of the equation, looking at skills that contribute to success and successful learners. And so we wanted to expand, or we're hoping to be able to expand the construct coverage to incorporate some of these newer domains that have emerged in the literature. We also want to improve the developmental sensitivity of the measure. So of course, 20 years ago, we were limited to paper and pencil versions of these questionnaires. And now, as you see there, one of our other goals is to digitize and make this all online, which affords the potential for customization and adaptation of the form so that we can hopefully be more precise and efficient, again, being sort of respectful of our respondents and their time. We all know teachers are busy and students have lots of demands. And so we're trying to improve the efficiency and the developmental sensitivity of the measure to hopefully yield more precise estimates of student skills. Another goal for us, the third goal here, is to update our standardization sample. With the original ACES, we have a nationally representative standardization sample, but again, that's 25 years old, or almost, I guess, 23 years old, 24 years old. At this point in time, and as we all know, our students across the US, our student population has become much more diverse in the last 20 so years. So our goal is to update that sample and have it become more representative in a number of ways, with regard to race, also with regard to ability, differing abilities, and regionality as well. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to digitize and then ultimately disseminate this. So the 4th year of the project, our goal is to make this available within the 4th year, and then solicit feedback and input from users to understand both the costs associated with use, because we know that's something that's of interest to IES as it is to us as well, as well as look at questions related to fairness, which I think is a really critical consideration, especially when we think about measurement development projects moving forward. So you can see that there's 4 phases to the project. Basically, those 4 phases correspond to years of the project, more or less. So we've been really heavily involved with item development over the past 15 months or so. We're transitioning into the item tryout and refinement phase, where we'll share these items with both students and teachers to look at how they function. And one of the key questions that we have for that phase is looking at issues related to bias or considerations related to bias. Are there concerns about that we need to take into account and think about with the items with regard to differences across known groups, for example? And then we're hoping next year, again, COVID and sort of how the pandemic plays out could influence this, but with standardization, we're going to move to standardization and validation phase of the project in year 3. So with the goal of by the end of the 2022-23 school year, to have the final version of the forms that we can then put on our platform, which we're just now beginning to develop and then launch in the last year of the project. So that hopefully gives you a sense of the scope of the project. You can see there that we do have a project website if you're interested to learn a little bit more, and it also has a link to the original versions of the forms. I think I typed it out in the chat. I'll send that along as well. But I know, Emily, you have some questions, so I'll stop there. And
yeah, thank you. So Jim, if you could, yep, great. Thank you. I was going to say, stop sharing your screen. So I think, so for me, I guess it's sort of it's a sort of 2 levels, this issue of your sample, right? I mean, you said explicitly one of your tasks of this project, this measurement grant, is to update the items to more accurately reflect the greater diversity in the student population in the United States. And you talked about, sort of these enablers and sort of expanding construct coverage and just trying to think through some of the items on a scale like this. And so I've been very interested in thinking about your item development phase, because I feel like, again, it's this notion of like, there's 2 things. You want to get the items right so that the ACES 2 will be useful moving forward, right? And I don't know if you said this explicitly, but you could use the ACES 2 for both research and practice, right? Yes, so it's got double, it's useful in many different ways. So we want it to become a useful measurement tool to avoid some of these issues around bias and make things equitable. But how are you intentionally, like, who's helping you develop these items and who's reacting to them, and how in the world do you kind of start thinking about, I don't know, maybe you could give us a specific item example to, like, I'm just thinking of like a student who's sitting paying attention in class, right? I'm just thinking of my own children, and they were paying attention, but it wouldn't have looked like it to anybody else. They I don't know, they multitasked or something. So we all have very different perceptions. And I think those things cut into these kind of race, ethnicity kinds of biases that are around behavior, right, in classrooms. So tell us more about, at this stage of item development, how you're really being very intentional about all of that. And knowing you don't want to have to update this thing in 20 years again, do you? So, or maybe somebody else. So like, how do we do this? How do we do this well?
Well, one of the things we're hoping for actually is by digitizing it, will allow us to do more real-time updates to it. It's one of the, I think, exciting things about technologies that are available to us today. But to your question, it's a great question. It's one, to be honest, I think our perspective in thinking about this has evolved over the last 2 years. From when we wrote the proposal. So in recognition, and I think Karen, you used this term a couple times as well, thinking about voice and input of students and other stakeholders into the item process. Of course, we had that goal initially, but I think what we've done is changed our sampling a bit to make sure that, not a bit, actually a lot early on, to make sure that we're building in stakeholder voices from the outset of the process. So originally, and again, thinking about how we review and sort of the systems that are in place related to our research, we of course had experts, identified experts that would provide us with feedback, and we're still incorporating expert feedback, but that potentially has limitations to it as well. And so while we're not totally throwing out the idea of getting expert feedback early in the process, we are, and we've changed so that we're soliciting actually from larger samples of teachers and students. We're actually just getting ready to start this phase. So we've already gotten some initial feedback from teachers, and we tried to be intentional with regard to both teacher race as well as location type of setting that they're teaching in, because that's another consideration. Of course, the teachers' perspectives are shaped by the students with whom they work and interact with most often. So we've been trying to stratify our sample in such a way to make sure that we are representing as best as possible, given the means that we can allocate to this phase, the diversity of schools and students across the country. So we've already gotten some initial teacher feedback on content and domains. And it was interesting, some of the domains that I would say we've pulled in from our review of research over the last 20 years didn't necessarily coincide with feedback that teachers were providing with. They seem to emphasize more of what I would characterize the original domains, the domains I mentioned that are in the original form. But so we've solicited teacher input. We've then based our item writing using that feedback as well as our review of literature and other sources to generate items that we're now about to share out with another sample, a separate sample of about 250 teachers that again are going to be drawn from across the country. And we're trying to also be mindful of again, their settings during their locales. And then we're going to have a similar size sample, maybe not quite as large, of students respond to the items that we're writing. So we've written the teacher items. We've just about finished with the student items as well. But again, we think it's important to get their perspective and to have those not just be representative. And this, I think, is one of the other things that has evolved for us as we thought about these considerations at the forefront of our project, beginning of our project. It's not just proportional representation, but actually equal representation, so that we're not prioritizing certain voices over others when we solicit these data early in the process. So it's actually caused us to reallocate some resources within our project to be able to do that, because we didn't originally intend to sample from quite that large of numbers at the outset. But we have some flexibility that we think will allow us to use those. We think it's a wise strategic, an important strategic investment here at the outset.
So sorry, I hope everybody else is going to want this next nudge, but can you say a little bit more about proportional versus equal representation here? Because I feel like that's a really important idea, and I don't know if I'm kind of completely understanding what you mean when you say it. So can you tell us a little bit more?
Sure.
about that?
Yeah. So for example, when our plan for our national standardization is to ultimately have demographics, particularly with regard to race, ethnicity, developmental level. So the vision is for these forms to be appropriate for K-12. So to have representation across this that are proportional to the national distribution, right? And so using the census projection, I think in 2026, the breakdown, at least race ethnicity, is like 45%, I think white Caucasian, 26% Hispanic Latinx, and then I believe it's 13% African American, and then the categories go down and get a little bit smaller. So for our national standardization, that was and still is our goal at that phase, and this is a later phase of the project. But so early on, though, our goal is to have equal representation in these where we're soliciting feedback on items, for example, on content, feasibility, developmental appropriateness, and then fairness, which is just, as I think I mentioned a few minutes ago, such a critical question. Bias in and of itself for those who are engaged in measurement or thinking about these issues is an important consideration when we think about fairness in the ultimate use of assessments, but it's not the only consideration. And so that's one of the questions that we're trying to ask as best we can on the front end about how, from teachers' perspectives, it's a little difficult. We're trying to think about how we can ask these questions of students. And we think we have some ideas of ways to ask it sort of indirectly, but we're admittedly still working on that right now. So does that help, Emily? Does that answer?
Oh my God, so much. Sorry. So just a sidebar. I've been Jim's program officer for as long as I've been at IES, but I don't monitor this grant. So I want to ask him all these really specific questions, but I won't do it because that's not the point of this session. But really quickly, for those of you who attended the opening plenary, Jim, this was not part of my questions I had sent you, but I just want you to, I'm curious if you are doing this, but Adrian Nishina talked about that category of students who are mixed race. And are you looking at students who are mixed race as well in the item development phase?
We are, yes, we are. This is, I think, where resources, and I can't believe I say that out loud when I think about the resources that we all have having IES projects, but it does even become a challenge when you have these resources. But yes, we are planning to sample from students who are of mixed races as well.
Good, because it was a fairly large percentage. I wrote it down and I don't have it at hand, but it's significant. I mean, it's enough that you want to know about these kids too, right?
Absolutely.
They're sort of a unique group.
Yeah,
so in the interest of time, I think we're doing well on time, but I did want to pause here and see if anybody in the audience has a question for Jim. Some of my friends at work are very good at wait time and I'm really bad at it. So I'm just going to keep us going. But remember, you can put questions in the chat. And I think we'll have time at the end for more of a discussion if we would like. So with that, Jim, thank you so much. And I'm going to turn things over to Wolfgang. And I'll just say the original thought for this session was sort of more focused on this part of it, the analysis phase, and sort of how you think about subgroups. And then it quickly became clear to me that it was a much bigger thing, but this is still really super important, right? And I think we all wish that there were sort of better ways, different ways at the analytic stage. So I asked Wolfgang to tell us about a specific, I don't know, Wolfgang, there's so much you do and many different kinds of things you could talk about, but I've always been particularly interested in the following, this idea of, you do sort of universal intervention with like a prevention model, knowing full well you won't get a main effect, right? Like not everybody needs this, it's modest people aren't going to change as a result of this, but there will be a critical subgroup that you want to benefit. And so what's the best way to see if you're benefiting that subgroup rather than just like later say, oh, there was no main effect. And so what happened here, so being much more intentional. But again, I'm going to stop and I'll let Wolfgang tell us.
Oh, it's fine. It's fine. Go on. I really enjoy it. Thank you very much. Yeah, so the basic tenet or premise of my short presentation is just the idea, and Emily already made that clear, that like systematic inequity in the population often manifests in systematic like subgroup differences in our samples. So if we want to be intentional in like uncovering inequity, we need to be very systematic in analyzing subgroups. And today I would like to I try to achieve now the improbable, and that is presenting to you under 10 minutes a highly complex method. Let's see whether I succeed. The method is called model-based recursive partitioning. It has been developed in the machine learning context, and basically it can be conceptualized as a data-driven, fully automated moderation analysis technique. The idea is that we can start to contextualize the statistical models we estimate and contextualize the estimates we're interested in. And by contextualizing, I just mean answering the question for whom, for example, does the treatment work and under which conditions? And maybe even more important, for whom doesn't it work? And what are the conditions that prevent people from improving? And MOB can be helpful to answer those questions. In general, MOB, I'm gonna pull on my laser pointer here. So MOB requires basically just two pieces of information as input. The first one is the statistical model of interest. So that could be like a pre-post comparison for control and treatment groups, or it could be a purely observational model of interest. We're not limited in the type of models. It could be linear, logistic, it could be a count regression, whatever you can think of, and whatever you cannot think of. The second piece of information is that is required is a list of covariates and the background variables that represent contextual factors. So here we are also not limited. Those could be continuous variables like age. It could be a binary variable like free and reduced lunch status. It could be a multi-categorical variable, race, ethnicity, stuff like that. And now the output that MOB delivers is comes in the form of a regression tree. And the regression tree itself consists of branches, and those branches are defined by the covariates we use. The covariates plus value ranges or category levels of those variables. I'm going to give you an example in a minute. At the end of each branch of those trees, we have subgroup specific models, so subgroup specific statistical models of interest, where those models are allowed to have varying parameter estimates, and they all share the feature that the parameters we're estimating in those subgroups are systematically different across the subgroups. So what does this mean? Let's just to make the idea, I hope, salient. Let's start with a simple toy hypothetical example. Yeah. To keep things simple, we have one predictor that is assumed to be continuous. Here on the x-axis, we have one outcome assumed to be continuous on the y-axis, and we just deal with the linear regression model. In addition, we have two covariates, Z1 and Z2. So now I need to quickly hide that. So the scatter plot here shows the relation for the total sample. Yeah. So now ignoring the coloring here for a second, if we have a look at that, we would conclude that there is not much going on between those two variables. So there is no upwards trend or systematic downwards trend, again, for the total sample, right? So we would conclude there is no relation between those two. The reality, however, is that those data have been generated according to the regression tree that is given here on the right side. And there are three hidden groups in the data, in the total data set. And those groups, they differ in two important aspects. The first aspect is the parameters of the model, so intercept and slope. So they differ in the nature of the relationship between predictor and outcome. So for example, the black group has a positive relation, the red group has a negative relation, the green group has no relation. The second aspect where those subgroups differ is the configuration of the covariates. And those configurations are used to describe features of the subgroup. So for example, let's say Z1 is a student's age, right? If it happens that we have a participant whose age is lower than a specific value, let's say younger than 8 years, then it's very likely that this person gets classified in the black subgroup here. If the age value of a certain of a student in the sample exceeds our threshold, so older than 8 years old, then it's more likely that the student will be classified in either the red or the green subgroup, and which itself depends on a second covariate. So let's say free and reduced lunch, yes and no. Now, the important thing is that MOB itself does not require that we know the covariates in the first place, and it does not require that we know the thresholds in the first place. So those are two pieces of information that will be found in the data automatically. So we let the data speak, so to speak. So how does this look in practice? Wait. Yeah. Okay. So here's a real world data example. That's the last slide. The context here is the data come from a pilot study from a randomized controlled trial where we were interested in the effect of a teacher classroom management training on student behavior. So specifically here, I'm going to concentrate on the outcome variable concentration problems. So if we start to have a look at the data just through the standard lens of we're testing a main effect, so we assume that the treatment is constant for everyone, and we assume that every single student reacts equally to the treatment, we observe, although we observe a slight decrease in concentration problems here, we end up with a non-significant result. So overall, for the entire sample, we have to conclude that there is no treatment effect. Now, through the lens of MOB, it actually turns out that within the data set, there are subgroups that respond differently to the treatment. And most important, it actually turns out that there is a significant effect. However, it's only located for the subgroups of first graders. So here we see the intended systematic decrease in concentration problems. For other students, the grades were K to 5. So for the remaining grades, we learned that another covariate here becomes important, that is gender. So now again, we have a second split, leaving overall, again, 3 groups, although that's just a coincidence that we have 3 groups here too. And within the other 2 groups, we learned that for male students not in the first grade, we have a small decrease. And for females not in the first grade, we have a small increase, both of them being non-significant in this case. Now, here it is important that, again, there is no pre-knowledge required for applying MOB, as long as we are measuring the background variables we want to include in the analysis, right? We are not limited in the scale of the covariate. Those could be continuous or down to binary, doesn't matter. And most important, this algorithm is able to find and describe way more complex moderation processes as would it be doable with standard moderation tests, like testing interactions and so on. So for example, just thinking of this tree structure here, this involves already 2 covariates. Including with the treatment in a standard analysis, we would have to estimate a three-way interaction for treatment condition, gender, and grade in order to uncover those differences. And nobody does that because it's hard to interpret, right? So for this reason, I think that this MOB algorithm, which from my perspective is a bit underutilized in the educational research setting, it brings value to the standard statistical toolbox. And since it's out there, I think we should just start to use it. So I know, again, it is impossible to go into the details of this complex method, but I hope that those 2 examples I provided you with might spark some interest, and maybe you have a question and I'm happy to answer it.
Thank you, Wolfgang. No, I think that was really, I don't know, you helped me to sort of to understand it better. But so I'm going to go ahead and jump in with my question, but then I do see someone in the audience put one in the chat for you, specifically Wolfgang as well. But so I guess, and sorry, Wolfgang, this is a bit off script from what I sent you ahead of time, but my questions were so generic. But I guess what I'm really, I think I'm understanding your point about like when you get into the much more complicated, like 3-way interactions, why this approach would be better. But then this idea where you mentioned like you don't need to know the covariates ahead of time. Like, are you talking about like sort of how everybody, so, and I'm glad you used that example of the classroom management intervention. That's exactly like the kind of thing I'm interested in as the social behavioral person for NCER. So like, you're right. So like you wouldn't, but there you do, you know the covariates, like you do know what the covariates are. So is MOB there, or you know the covariates that I think you would care about, right? For who you think might benefit the most. Like for example, teachers who at baseline test, you know, they test lower on certain constructs. So is really then like, I'm just trying to think, is there really any excuse for people not having a good sense of covariates and good baseline data to start with? I mean, I'm just trying to understand exactly what the significance of what you're saying about you don't need to know that beforehand and how I should think about that in terms of like just thoughtfully designed studies.
Yeah, so I think both is doable. So, so I think the key question is how would you define a subgroup, right? Do you define it in a confirmatory way, which means you need to know We need to have information prior the analysis, or are you okay with identifying subgroups empirically? And I think both can be done even in an integrated way. So let's say you suspect that baseline scores, they should interact with your responsiveness to treatment. That's a very common test, interaction test that is done, like a common moderation test. Nothing stops you from, in the statistical model I've presented, to include an interaction like this, and then just ask, does the moderation effect you are hypothesizing depend on other contextual factors? So, and that's where I think the power of MOB kind of comes in, that you're able to even find systematic differences in confirmatory interaction effects, if you like. So I hope this kind of answers your, I'm not sure, probably not.
Sorry, I realized I muted myself. No, it does help me. I think what I will do, I see you're getting some questions, Wolfgang, in the chat. So yes. I'm gonna, can you see those? Or do you want me to?
Okay, wait, we're thinking about the grade level. So where does it start? Hello, everyone?
Oh, so I'm sorry. So I was thinking about this one from Chun Wang, which is, does MOB suffer from omitted variable bias?
Oh yeah, yes, it does. Yes, it does. Which means what you don't have, you can't account for. It's as easy as that. So it does not remedy like classical threats to causal inference. Of course not. It's just, it helps you in a data-driven way to be more fine-grained in the statements for who is actually benefiting from the treatment and who is not. So I hope this answers the question. In the example, the significant had been found within one of the partitions formed by the tree in the MOB method. Do significant sets like that one encounter for the model search? Yes. So here it's important that those methods. So a common critique is, well, you're kind of doing data fishing and you're p hacking or whatever. The MOB algorithm itself adjusts for the number of tests that are done. So there is no, the chance of coming up with spurious significant effects is a kind of like adjusted for already. The other important thing is the actual information that is used to find those partitions is not the significance of a variable. It is really just the point estimate and how different it is compared to other subgroup. So it might be the case that you end up with subgroups where there is no effect significant, but it is just qualitatively different in the sense that the actual point estimates differ. Or like in our example, it might happen that you find a subgroup where there is also a significant effect. So you get a difference in the point estimate, plus this difference is so large that it cannot no longer be distinguished from, that it cannot be, it can be distinguished from change, if that makes sense. How does MOB handle the nesting of students within higher level unit? Yeah, so the method we have, I've used here accounts for multi-level modeling. So you can, I think at the moment you can only go up to 2 levels. So if you have 3-level models, you probably need to use a fixed effect approach to do that. But again, those fixed effects can, for example, be part of your focal model so that you always account for that. So that's, but yes, in general, 2-level models have been developed already. How does this compare to a latent mixture modeling approach? Here, the groups are manifest in the sense that it is really, like in our example, it's really the non-first graders and the males that showed a small increase. So there is no latent variable involved at all. It is all happening on manifest levels. So yeah. So you can think of it as, oh, is it answered? Yeah. Okay, good.
So I'm going to jump in, Wolfgang, and just say, then this sort of, I think, tell me if I'm overstating this.
Mhm.
I mean, one of my questions to you was sort of, does this sort of help when you haven't been intentional until this stage, right? So like if you kind of blew it at project design and you made a mistake with data collection, like what kinds of early errors can mob sort of fix? And would it be overstating it to say that because they're empirically derived, like it's coming out of your own data, it's sort of, you're discovering it, and so it's okay that you didn't think of it beforehand?
The second is a philosophical question.
I like to be very philosophical sometimes about this.
Yeah. So if you don't discover it, is it there or is it not there? So it's like the tree, right? That the forest. But sort of coming to the first question first, I think mob cannot remove biases like late in the game. If you have not considered an important factor that leads to treatment differences and you don't have any documentation,
Right.
What it is. As long as you are, as long as you have information or assessments of contextual factors where you were not mindful enough in the design phase, then mob can still be helpful. And the other, I think, benefit of it is this could be a high dimensional data setting, which means you're basically not limited in the number of covariates that you put in. Mob will really just focus on those that create the large parameter instabilities. To the second question, yes, of course, the regression tree you come up with, it kind of belongs to your data set. That's also a common critique in this sort of assembly methods. But one important aspect, and due to time reasons, I didn't get there. One important element of any mob application is to test the robustness of your results. So it's just like with, because mixture modeling was mentioned, just like with latent class analysis, you get always a result. And it's then you jump in and build a narrative around your result a little bit. It happens here the same way with mob, but usually as a last step, you start to bootstrap your data set and see how often do you really get the same tree? How often are really the same subset of covariates selected for building the tree? And if the stable is robust, if the solution is robust and stable, you would expect that the same number of variables are selected over and over and over again. Same with the thresholds that are computed. Let's say age is selected as a covariate, and let's say, again, a threshold of 8 years has been found ideal as a splitting criterion. If the tree is robust, if it's really a thing, so to speak, then you would come up with this solution over and over again. And I think that is an important element of those sorts of machine learning techniques.
Thank you. No, that helps. So a question came in on the chat from Megan Carvinen. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. So this, and you're kind of getting at something I think it's been in the back of my mind, this idea of intersectionality, right? So when you have sort of multiple intersecting kind of subgroups. And so what are some like challenges and opportunities there when you think about multiple kinds of dimensions of identity? And so, Karen, do you want to tackle that first? Maybe we'll go in order, just to give everybody a chance.
Sure. Thanks for that question. We think about this a lot in our work. In our course taking study for our R&D center, we wrote into our proposal, just thinking about Wolfgang's talk, we are really interested in looking at subgroups and the way that, for example, newcomer students versus students who've been in US schools for many years, students who are classified as English learners, but also identified as having a disability, they make up a very large percentage of students classified as English learners at the secondary level. So when we're looking at malleable factors impacting course access and achievement, being really intentional that we're not just looking at what is this overall effect or pattern, but how is this particularly impacting different groups with different intersectional identities? Also thinking about language linguistic groups, race and ethnicity within the English learner population. So there's lots of complexity, and we are trying to be mindful. And I think the more that we uncover all the different intersectional identities, it can help our policymaker and practitioner partners be more intentional about the ways they're framing their policies and practices.
Yeah, no, I would particularly in the policy space, I feel like that's really important to be clear about those intersections. Jim.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Excuse me. I mean, it is a great question. And it's interesting, I think for me, as we've been thinking about sampling both early in the project and then thinking about it later, I've been thinking about more and more in dimensions that our sampling plan, in my mind, at least, I was trying to think of a way to visually represent this, but can come up with a good way for a slide, is at least like a Rubik's Cube, if not probably stretching into additional dimensions for whatever that would look like because of the intersectionality of race, ability, disability, geographic location, socioeconomic status. I mean, there's all these variables that could come into play, and we want to try to capture as many of them, but recognize that even again with the resources that we have, and by the end of the project, we should, if we're able to hit our marks, have completed scales for about 7,000 kids at some point. Not all self-reported, not all teacher report, but collectively about 7,000. And even with those kinds of numbers, I don't think we could fully cross all of these dimensions on which we're interested. So what we're trying to do is prioritize and go out as far as we can. And then the other piece, and this ties in, actually, I noticed there was an earlier question too. There are, I think, limits that we run into as well. Someone had asked a question about younger kids and our ability to get feedback and input from younger children. And obviously that's a huge potential challenge for us. I don't think I mentioned that the original version of the student form went down to 6th grade. We're trying to push it down earlier, and we're hoping to get down to 3rd grade. But this next round of data collection, or first round of data collection with students, I think will be really telling in terms of if that's a feasible possibility for us. But I think there are also ways, not to take us off on a tangent, where we might be able to leverage technology to where we encounter those sort of boundaries potentially to perhaps push them a bit further.
No, thank you. Yeah, no, and Jim, you reminded me that Allison Billman had a question early on that I think you did address, which was sort of getting those responses from the younger kids, and in terms of that equal representation piece. Wolfgang, I don't know if you want to say any more about intersectionality here in terms of
I think I already indirectly mentioned that by saying that because of the recursive nature of the methodology, it's ideally suited to operate in a high dimensional space.
Yeah. And then you have one more question here from, this is for, David Francis has multiple questions for people. One for Wolfgang on binary outcomes. Can Mob do binary outcomes?
Yeah, so I answered it in the chat already. Binary outcomes are fine. Logistic regression is implemented. Multivariate outcomes, I'm not aware of any implementation of that yet, but maybe you want to check out Achim Zeilais. I can put his name in the chat.
That'd be great. And then I love David's question to Jim, because I do remember when you were developing this application and we were talking about sort of how are you going to get a national sample with the measurement project budget, right? There are some limits to what we support. And so advice, Jim, on the national sample piece.
Don't do it. No, I say away. No, I kid. But I think, and unfortunately, we just missed when they expanded the funding for the measurement projects. See, we came in under the old budget, which maybe we should have waited a year. But I think we're working, again, we're trying to leverage technology, and the assessments that we're developing lend themselves to this, of course, right? That we can, because they are these rating scales, we can use digital distribution methods, which opens up a lot of possibilities for us. Whereas if we were developing something that was a direct form of assessment, it would be a little more challenging. We are trying to draw on our professional networks, or we're drawing on our professional networks, and to, particularly for validity studies. I didn't talk about those as much, but again, that's something we've been thinking more and more about from a sampling perspective, and not just having proportional representation, but equal representation. And so we're using a combination approach of site coordinators in regions, and we've taken the map and broken it up by region, where we're going to work with site coordinators to help us with those. But then we're also, for some of these larger data collection efforts, working with Qualtrics to help us with recruitment. Perhaps others have worked with them as well, but they have large standing panels, including teachers and students. And so that is something that's evolved for us here during the first part of our project. And we're really excited about the reach that we've been able to achieve, even just with our early phases through that partnership.
Great, thank you for that. All right, I don't think I've missed any other questions in the panel. We have about 5 minutes if there are any other questions folks have. And I don't think I missed anything. So Wolfgang, I think you sparked interest. You were concerned about how this, whether you could talk about this in this sort of a context, and I think you did it. I'm going to be thinking a lot more about this particular technique. So I think on that note, I guess I'll wrap things up by first saying, thank you. I think if nothing else, that I've been excited about with the conference and sort of this idea is just this notion of being more intentional, right? Like, we're not always going to get it right, and we will make mistakes. But I think that as long as people are just stopping at least and thinking about these issues at different stages, that's a great start. Oh, and Jim, I see disappointment in the chat that there's no preschool ACEs. And I didn't know there was a college ACEs. I didn't have any idea of that. So is that your next grant? Preschool ACEs?
Hopefully, yeah, it's on the radar. Yeah.
That would be great. So anyway, thanks to everybody. Thanks to our panelists. Thank you, Karen. It's great to meet you and hear more about your work. Wolfgang, I think you're going to get lots of questions and more stuff about MOB. Jim, thank you. I'm going to be looking forward to kind of seeing progress on ACEs too. And thank you to our audience. And thanks. I think we got through the second day, right, of the meeting. So one more day tomorrow. So please be sure to rate the session, leave comments. We welcome your feedback. So thanks to everyone.